Hey everyone, Erick Stakelbeck here. Welcome to a Watchman Newscast live stream. Great to be with you on a very rainy and windy day here on the East Coast of the United States where I live. But it's great to be with you today. We've got a lot to talk about. We have some breaking news that I want to get into from Capitol Hill in the swamp known as Washington, D.C., where I used to live in that area until just about a year ago. Believe it or not, I was down there for 17 years living in the D.C. area. Now I am in parts unknown, but on the East Coast of the United States, as you know. Great to be with you today. We'll get into that breaking news in a minute. I want to give just a minute for some people to join us. We've got several hundred already. This will grow to thousands, as we usually have on our Watchman Newscast live streams right here on YouTube. Again, we are going, pardon me as I adjust my seat here, we're going till 5 p.m. Eastern Time. I will be taking your questions during the second half of our live stream. A lot to talk about today and a lot to unpack. On yesterday's newscast, we discussed the Squad, this anti-Israel, radical left-wing, progressive, I call it regressive group, a faction, a strong and growingly influential faction of the Democrat Party, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Ariana Presley. They're the four main faces of the Squad. Well, they came out very strongly this week and pressured the Democrat leadership, led by Nancy Pelosi, to drop funding for Iron Dome, Israel's groundbreaking, incredibly effective missile defense system, which has a 90% success rate. Imagine that. We saw it in action, obviously, back in May during that recent war between Israel and Hamas. I saw it up close. We brought it to you here on the Watchman Newscast, an up-close look at Iron Dome. Democrats, a faction of the Democrat Party here in the United States. I know we have viewers from around the world. Someone said the Witches of Eastwick. That's a good one. I know we have viewers from around the world, but this is the U.S. House of Representatives that the Squad, which they call themselves, represents. Okay, you know what? We've got enough people here. Let's get into the breaking news. It relates to the Squad. I gave everyone a few minutes to hop on. The breaking news is that Iron Dome legislation has now passed. Thankfully, it has passed the U.S. House of Representatives. A minute ago, if you're just joining us, I was giving a little bit of background on what's gone down this week. This radical left-wing faction of the Democrat Party, and the Democrat Party in general, is going more and more far to the left, as we know, sadly. But in particular, you have the very way out there Marxist, radical, anti-Israel left wing of the party, led by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib. They call themselves the Squad. Long story short, on Tuesday, just 2 days ago, there was legislation to basically keep the U.S. government open. Remember, Democrats control every lever of power now in the U.S. government, the House, the Senate, and the presidency. And the legislation that came forward in the U.S. House of Representatives was essentially to continue to fund the U.S. government. Well, Republicans added in there, hey, part of this should be funding Iron Dome, Israel's missile defense system, $1 billion of funding for Iron Dome. And AOC and her cronies actually refused to endorse the legislation. They threatened to vote against it. They threatened the House leadership, led by Nancy Pelosi, that if Pelosi and the Democrat leaders did not remove funding for Iron Dome, then AOC and her crew would vote against the legislation. So what happened? Did Nancy Pelosi and Democrat leaders say, hey, do what you want to do? We stand with Israel. It shouldn't be a partisan issue, although sadly it is increasingly a partisan issue here in the United States. Did they stand strong? Of course they didn't. They caved to the pressure from the Squad. In the process, empowered these left-wing radicals even more. And the Democrat leaders pulled funding for Iron Dome from this legislation, and then the Squad voted for it. But right away, it has to be said, some of the more moderate Democrats, there are a few left at least, came out and said, hey, this is ridiculous. We have to fund Iron Dome. We stand with Israel. And they did criticize AOC and the far left flank of the party. Here's the problem, folks. That far left flank is becoming increasingly powerful and influential, and increasingly they are the face of the Democrat Party. There are some moderates scattered there still, but they are increasingly being drowned out and marginalized by the loudest and most influential voices in the room. The Squad and AOC and Ilhan Omar basically have Nancy Pelosi and the Democrat leadership over a barrel, and they are pretty savvy political actors. They've shown once again with this latest controversy over Iron Dome. The good news is the legislation did pass today. Iron Dome will be funded to the tune of $1 billion. But the damage was done, in my view, and there are questions arising. Certainly in Israel, and Israeli lawmakers have downplayed this, of course. They've said, hey, it's just a technicality, and the funding's still going to go through. But there are certainly questions right now in Jerusalem, I can tell you for sure, certainly here in the United States, about the future of U.S. support for Israel. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today. We've already got many people with us. We've got a very active chat going on. I'm looking at it right now. I'm scrolling down and seeing the comments. This is great. Someone makes the point Pelosi is on her way out. Pookie Martinez, Pelosi is on her way out. When that happens, oh my! I think that's a great point. Pelosi, this is the old guard, Pelosi and Schumer and the AOCs of the world, the Ilhan Omars, again, very influential, very vocal, millions of followers on social media. They never met a camera they didn't like, and they're out there. They're out there in more ways than one. They're out there with their ideology, but they're also out there in front of the cameras, making their presence felt on a regular basis and kicking up a lot of dust. So as the old guard, the old liberal Democrat guard passes on, these will be the new faces, folks. And that's to my point that I was just making. That is why you're seeing concern in Jerusalem about the future of the U.S.-Israel relationship. Clearly, the pro-Israel community here in the United States is also extremely concerned as well. Yair Lapid and some of the Israeli leaders in the new Israeli government are blaming the Democrats doing this the other day, cutting funding to Iron Dome, temporarily at least. Again, the breaking news we had at the top, the funding did go through today. New legislation was passed that did include the funding for Iron Dome, thankfully. But Lapid and some Israeli officials are saying, hey, this is Bibi's fault because Bibi isolated and alienated the Democrats during his reign, and he was too close to Trump. That's some of the opinions going around right now among Israeli officials and leaders that you're hearing. But folks, I have to say, they're wrong about this. I said this on yesterday's newscast. If you missed it, you can check it out here in our archives on YouTube. While you're there, be sure to subscribe if you haven't, and click the notification bell so you get alerts every time a new video is posted. Folks, with everything going on right now, you don't want to miss a day. Trust me, we're coming to you every day with breaking, cutting-edge analysis here on the Watchman Newscast. But I made the point on yesterday's newscast that it doesn't matter who the leader of Israel is. Bibi, okay, he was a right-wing guy, and throughout his tenure, the mainstream media and the left screamed and howled that he was a right-wing extremist, and they said, this is why we oppose Israel, because of Bibi and his right-wing government. Well, guess what? Israel now, for better or for worse, probably has the most diverse governing coalition of any government in the world. Right-wing parties, obviously led by the new Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, right-wing parties, far left-wing parties, centrist parties, even an Arab Islamist party, all part of this governing coalition, which, by the way, includes 8 different parties. Now, that's the height of diversity. You would think the left would love that. That's what they've been asking for, right? They didn't like this right-wing Netanyahu government, these so-called extremists. Well, now you don't have that. Now you have a very diverse coalition. And guess what? They're still anti-Israel, and they still opposed the funding to Iron Dome. Folks, what does this tell you? They don't care who leads Israel. It's not about Israel's leader. It's about Israel itself, Israel's very existence as a nation state. You could have had a left-wing prime minister, and AOC and the gang still would have blocked funding for Iron Dome. They don't care. They hate the Jewish state. That's the bottom line, no matter who leads it. Not about the leader. They are blatantly anti Semitic. It's pretty obvious. When you want to put the world's one and only Jewish state, a democracy, a Western outpost in the middle of the world's most chaotic and volatile region, the cradle of Judeo Christian civilization, where our civilization, Judeo Christian Western civilization, was born. When you want to put that in jeopardy, and that's exactly what you're doing, when you cut funding to Iron Dome, which has saved countless, not only Israeli, but Arab and Palestinian lives over the past decade. When you want to do that, and Israel obviously leans so heavily on Iron Dome, it is the first line of defense. You want to cut funding to that? You want to consciously weaken the state of Israel if you support that. And you are consciously and knowingly putting innocent civilians at risk. Again, Israeli and Arab and Palestinians. That's what you're doing. If you want to do away with Iron Dome, which is a purely defensive system. This isn't funding missiles and tanks. This is funding a system, an anti-missile defense system that is purely for defensive purposes and to save civilian lives. And you want to cut that? Folks, that tells you something. Again, doesn't matter who the leader is, the political makeup of Israel, it's about Israel's existence. And without Iron Dome over the past 10 years or so, since Iron Dome was really put into action around 2011 or so, without Iron Dome, we would have seen mass casualties. Number one, I do not say that lightly. I cited a statistic yesterday. 15 rockets launched out of Gaza, 1,500, I'm sorry, 1,500 rockets launched out of Gaza during that May 2021 conflict were headed directly for Israeli civilian neighborhoods. 1,400 of those 1,500 rockets were shot out of the sky by Iron Dome. Without Iron Dome, there's a good chance that all 1,500 of those rockets would have barraged Israeli cities and towns. And folks, let me tell you, we showed you here in the newscast a little while ago, and I've seen it up close. I have seen the devastation and destruction caused by those Hamas rockets. I stood inside a home in Ashkelon, Israel, about 10 miles north of Gaza, the Hamas stronghold. I stood inside what used to be a home, I should say. This home was completely obliterated and destroyed. It was rubble, thanks to one of these Hamas rockets, which was supplied by the Iranian regime. Bigger payloads now, they travel greater distances. These are Iranian supplied rockets. One of those rockets destroyed this home in Ashkelon, destroyed a man's livelihood. You may remember him. Asher was his name, an older guy, probably in his late 60s, early 70s, I believe. But we had it here in the newscast and on the Watchman TV show. He lost everything. Not only that, a caretaker who was living with his family, who was not an Israeli citizen, she was from India. She was killed in this rocket attack. So multiply that times, I don't know, 1,500, 3,000, 5,000, and that's what you would have had without Iron Dome. So I say all of that to say and to drive the point home for you that what AOC and Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib did on Tuesday, and today, by the way, this legislation that did ultimately pass, funding Iron Dome, they voted against that today. I believe there were 8 Democrats who voted against it. It passed overwhelmingly, which is, hey, look, that's a glimmer of hope, right? That this passed overwhelmingly, this legislation today, that even some House Democrats said, hey, wait a minute, this is crazy. We got to support Israel. There are still a few, thank God. Oftentimes, it certainly does not seem that way. I think of the commander-in-chief a few years ago, Barack Obama, who was openly, to my mind, anti-Israel and led the most anti-Israel administration in American history. It seems like the Biden administration will probably be on the road to contesting for that dubious distinction. Fasten your seatbelts. If they're going to bow to pressure from the radical leftist wing, Marxist wing of their party, then we have a big problem. Guess what? That's what they did on Tuesday. So we have a big problem. We are there right now. Hey, if you're just joining us, let's see. Israel forever. Amen. Christian patriots need to wake up. Amen. We've got some good people here writing in. This is great. This is great. And we have thousands of people already, and we're at about 17 minutes in. Let's look real quick. Let me glance. We will have Daniel, my trusty producer, will be sending questions along. So remember, Q&A at the end of this live stream. Send your questions along now. And what are your thoughts on the squad and all of this? To me, it's a major problem. You know, we can sit here and say, well, they're a bunch of clowns and they're just a bunch of left-wing kooks and radicals and Marxists. You know, folks, 20 years ago, that might be the way to view it. Not now, not in 2021. This ain't your grandfather's Democrat Party, to say the least. Not that that was any great shakes, but look, I'll take Truman and Kennedy over Bernie and AOC. Put it that way, to say the least. So that Democrat Party is long gone. Let me tell you. I like to tell people I grew up with in Philadelphia, um, who still are voting Democrat. Guys, it ain't what it used to be. Wake up. AOC and the rest are obviously wielding great power for sure. And I'm not trying to get all partisan here. I know I am. It's unavoidable. I'm talking about legislation that was blocked by a radical faction of the Democrat Party. So it's kind of hard not to be partisan and talk partisan politics right now. This was a bad thing. It's becoming pretty clear that partisan, and this is a sad thing, but partisan lines are being drawn when it comes to support for Israel between Republicans and Democrats. There is an increasingly influential and powerful anti-Israel bloc in the Democrat Party. That's undeniable. And the Republican Party is almost uniformly pro-Israel. I wish it wasn't that way. I wish both parties were equally pro-Israel. And hey, look, this legislation supporting Iron Dome did pass overwhelmingly today. A lot of Democrats, a vast majority of Democrats did vote for it. But what about when the rubber hits the road? And we had a rubber hits the road type moment on Tuesday. Again, legislation would not pass without the support of the squad. So Nancy Pelosi caved and said, man, I need their support. So sorry, I'm going to cave to their demands and drop funding for Iron Dome. Even though the legislation passed today, 2 days later, Iron Dome will be funded. That's phenomenal. That's great. Like I said earlier, the damage is done because a message was sent. The squad, so called, flexed their political muscle. Democrat leaders caved. You give them an inch, they take a mile. They will be empowered and emboldened right now, much like the enemies of America abroad, much like China and Iran and North Korea and Russia and other adversaries in the wake of the disastrous Afghanistan pullout. But that's a political scene right now. I can assure you that Jerusalem right now is concerned about the future of the U.S.-Israel alliance, because they're kidding themselves that they think, well, it's because of Bibi and there were still hard feelings and sour grapes over Netanyahu speaking before Congress in 2015. If you remember, he in 2015 gave that speech where he directly opposed the Iran nuclear deal, speaking before a joint session of Congress, a powerful, powerful address by the former Israeli prime minister that did not win him any friends, obviously, among Democrats. President Obama was in office at the time, but this vote this week by the squad, or this power move by the squad, was not a holdover from the days of Bibi. I can assure you, no matter who is in power in Israel, they're going to oppose Israel, because at the end of the day, the likes of Rashida Tlaib, they're not going to recognize Israel's right to exist. And that's just the way it is. And they have a forum and a platform now. They should be marginalized and really pushed out of their party. But the opposite is happening. They are consuming the party and becoming the face of their party. This is dangerous. And I think deep down, Israeli leaders have to recognize this. So where does the U.S.-Israel relationship go? Let's see. We have some more comments coming in here. We got people. I'm just scrolling down a bit. We've got some active. None of the squad are Christians. Surprised? I don't think they are. I think Love and Mercy is the handle there that wrote that. None of the squad are. I think you're right there, to say the least. If there are any Christians among the squad, they're certainly not living out their faith and walking the walk, to say the least. And Marxism and Christianity don't generally go together, to say the least. And this is certainly a Marxist ideology which is growing in the Democrat Party. I think it's undeniable. That's not alarmism. It's not sensationalism. These are the beliefs that are espoused. Folks, Bernie Sanders almost won the Democrat nomination twice, and he is a self-avowed socialist. So this is where we're moving. I think most people watching know the direction the political winds are blowing here in the U.S., and it's not good. So where does the U.S.-Israel relationship go from here? To me, this was a watershed moment in all the wrong ways this week, with what happened with the Iron Dome funding being blocked, even temporarily. Again, the message was sent. Two things. Number one, Democrat Party, as we've been discussing, can't rely on them anymore to staunchly support Israel. And there's been more and more criticism of Israel, including during that May war with Hamas, by some prominent Democrats who aren't on the radical squad wing of the party. People who have portrayed themselves as very pro-Israel, like Chuck Schumer, the New York senator, was strangely silent and muted during that May war between Israel and Hamas, where Hamas fired some 12,000 rockets, if not more, may have been closer to 15,000, into Israel or at Israel. Again, Iron Dome, which they didn't want to fund, shot down some 90% of those rockets. But Schumer, Pelosi, they're taking the political temperature, and they see that their party is going far to the left. Guess what? Joe Biden has taken the same measure of his party, and he sees it as well. And you see it reflected not only in his policies, but in his cabinet and the people he has surrounded himself with at every level. Not good. And I am understating that, folks. Not good. So we have that. You can no longer rely on the Democrat Party to be a staunch supporter of Israel. Secondly, you have AOC and the squad and that whole ideology growing rapidly in the Democrat Party, in particular among the grassroots of the Democrat Party and the younger factions of the Democrat Party. Thirdly, we have a very weak leader here in the US right now, and weak leadership at the top that has shown that it cannot be relied on to stand with allies. It has shown that it's not respected or feared by enemies, by adversaries. How do I know that? I just saw it play out in real time before my very eyes in Afghanistan with that disastrous withdrawal. So three elements there. Democrats going way left, leaning more to the social justice pro-Palestinian cause. Secondly, the most radical elements of the Democrat Party gaining power and influence. Thirdly, weak Democrat leadership at the top here at the White House right now. Combine all of that. Not a good place right now, in my view, for the U.S.-Israel relationship. Both sides can say and will say all the right things. Look, Naftali Bennett, the new Israeli prime minister, was in D.C. last month, had what seemed to be a very cordial meeting with Joe Biden. It was all good vibes coming out of that, and all the right things were said. But he met with Biden in the middle of the Afghanistan debacle unfolding. So Bennett sees what's going on here without a doubt. Biden, in his UN General Assembly speech on Tuesday, another thing to note here, folks, said two things of note for our Watchman Newscast purposes. Number one, he once again called for the establishment of a Palestinian state, although Israel has no willing or credible partner on the other side of the aisle. I said the other day, pick your poison. On one end, you have Hamas. On the other end, you have Mahmoud Abbas. But Biden, nonetheless, is still pushing for a Palestinian state. Even though the Abraham Accords, by the way, and we just passed the one-year anniversary of the Abraham Accords, even though the Abraham Accords have shown that to have peace with its neighbors, Israel doesn't need to have a separate peace with the Palestinians. Obviously, nations are lining up to sign on to the Abraham Accords. And I believe if President Trump had a second term, that more nations would have signed on already, including Saudi Arabia. I interviewed former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo last month in D.C. You might have seen it on our China documentary we did for TBN, The Rise of China, that China threat. It was on TBN last week. If you missed that, I strongly encourage you to check that out, folks. It's in our archives under U.S. News here on our YouTube channel, The Rise of China. I interviewed Secretary Pompeo and some other top China analysts and experts. It was alarming to know the inroads that China is making around the world and how they are growing in strength to directly challenge the U.S. But Pompeo said off camera as we were chatting, he said, if we would have gotten a second term, the Saudis and other nations most likely would have already signed on to the Abraham Accord. So I say that to say you don't need a separate treaty with the Palestinians to bring Arab nations into the fold. So that is a good thing to know. But the Biden administration has apparently not gotten the memo. A real quick note before we move on, programming note tonight on TBN. If you love the Watchman Newscast and you watch every day, Monday through Friday, and sometimes on the weekends, you will love the Watchman TV show. It is our weekly 30-minute television show on TBN. Airs Thursday nights, 10 p.m. Eastern Time, and Fridays, 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We've got a brand new episode tonight talking 1-year anniversary of the Abraham Accords, but also talking to Joel Rosenberg, my good friend, New York Times bestselling author, about his new book, Enemies and Allies. Joel is always great. If you know his work, you've seen him on The Watchmen before. He is based in Jerusalem, but he's doing a book tour here in the States right now. I believe he's in D.C. right now. Really strong interview. And the thing that's great about Joel Rosenberg is he gives you the firsthand perspective based on his meetings with the likes of Israeli leaders, Netanyahu, Trump, MBS, Arab leaders like MBS, the Saudi crown prince. Joel has met with all of them, and he gives you that firsthand insight and perspective in our interview tonight. Don't miss that. 10 o'clock Eastern on TBN, and the replay tomorrow, Friday, at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Back to the UN General Assembly speech. Wow, this is great. People, we have a lot, very active comments and a very active chat going on right now. So I expect a lot of great questions at the end when we wrap up and we get to questions in about 10, 15 minutes. Joe Biden, the other thing of note he said yesterday at the UN General Assembly was that he wants to re-enter that Iran deal. He kind of contradicted himself. We said Tuesday, not yesterday, I'm sorry. But he said on one hand, we are going to stop Iran from getting the bomb. Iran will not acquire nuclear weapons on my watch. All sounds great. Not true, but they won't get nuclear weapons, but only because Israel won't allow it, not because Biden will keep his word, as we've seen time and time again. Nonetheless, he said that, but in the next breath, he says, but we're ready to re-enter the Iran nuclear deal. He talks tough in one breath. Iran will not get the bomb on my watch. But in the next breath, he says, we are ready to re-enter that deal. If Iran is compliant and they want to abide by the deal, we're all in. Still, he's still clamoring and pining and praying and hoping to be a part of that Iran nuclear deal, a reincarnated version of that disastrous deal that President Trump rightly pulled the U.S. out of in May 2018, that President Obama got us into in July 2015, and which Biden wants to get us back into as we sit here in September 2021. On that note, the Iranian regime, the same day as Biden's speech this Tuesday, announced that they are ready to resume nuclear talks with the U.S. and other world powers like France, Britain, Germany, sometime in the next few weeks in Vienna. Now, it's been a pause since June. The Iranians were saying, we want to wait until Ibrahim Raisi, the butcher of Tehran, that brand new Iranian president, we want to wait until he is in office, and then we will resume negotiations with the U.S. and Western powers. But there's some chatter today out of Washington, D.C., out of the Biden White House. They're saying, well, we're not sure if Iran's going to come back to the table. They said the other day that they were planning to, and Raisi said it in his UN speech on Tuesday, his maiden voyage at the UN. But the Biden White House says, we're not quite sure if Iran will come back to the table. To me, looking at the situation, I say, good. There never should have been a table in the first place. The U.S. should have never been at the table in the first place, and they should have walked away from the table once they got there many moons ago. So there should be no table to begin with, with the Iranian regime until the Iranian regime vows to give up its sponsorship of terror, give up its nuclear program, and give up its lethal ballistic missile program. That hasn't happened. It's not going to happen. So at the end of the day, there may very well be no new negotiations between the Iranian regime, the United States, and other world powers. Either way, this is going in the wrong direction, folks. Think about it. If Iran and the U.S. sit down at the table, surely the negotiations will be dragged out and Iran will push and push closer to the finish line for its nuclear program. We've heard so many reports, and I've shared all of them with you on the newscast over the past few months, that not only Israeli officials, but U.S. officials believe Iran is 2 months or so from having enough enriched uranium to build a nuclear bomb. We are at a very, very dangerous threshold here for sure. Just realize that. So that's one part of it. Say the talks do resume and they drag on, and eventually there is some kind of deal. It's not going to be a good deal. It's going to be a carbon copy, I believe, of the 2015 deal. What does that mean? It means, number one, Iran's ballistic missile program and its sponsorship for terror, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the ring of fire that surrounds Israel right now, and which is also attacking U.S. personnel in Iraq, that issue will not be addressed. And that's the biggest issue. Iran's funding for terror, its ballistic missile program, it's 1A next to number one, which is Iran's nuclear program. Iran's precision guided missiles, of course, none of that will be on the table. It will just be the nuclear program. And once again, there will be that sunset clause. What does that mean? It means that when the sun sets on the deal, when the deal ends, maybe it'll be 5 years from now, maybe it'll be a 10-year deal they put together. When that ends, Iran can do whatever it wants. And if Iran's 2 months away from having enough enriched uranium now to have the bomb, they'll just wait 5 years, 10 years. The deal runs out, the sun sets, and they break out, and voila, we wake up one day and Iran announces we have successfully tested a nuclear device. That's where it's heading if the Iran nuclear deal goes back into effect. And part B to that is Iran, as part of the deal, remember, all sanctions, that's what Iran's demanding. Raisi demanded it at the UN the other day, that all sanctions will be dropped against Iran. What does that mean? It means Iran will be flush with cash, billions of dollars in sanctions relief into the Iranian regime's coffers. And what does that mean? What are they going to do with that money? I said it yesterday, I'll say it again. They're not going to use the billions of dollars in sanctions relief to build schools and playgrounds and theaters in Tehran. They will supply it to their proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the like, to destroy schools and playgrounds and theaters in Israel. That's how this works. So, Iran nuclear deal, absolute disaster. And Israel, I believe, would eventually be forced to act because Iran's going to violate the deal. The Biden administration kept saying, well, they've kept to the letter, the Obama administration, I'm sorry, they've kept to the letter of the deal. They have not violated it. And we're only, 2 years in, 3 years in. And Iran is very cagey, very crafty. The game of chess was created in ancient Persia, which is modern day Iran. And there are ways to get around UN inspectors and all the rest. And Iran has done that masterfully, I'm sad to say, over the past few years. So you can't have confidence that they're going to comply with any kind of nuclear deal. So that's one part. The second part is if the Iran nuclear deal doesn't go through, all the deal does is kick the can down the road, folks. Okay, maybe 5 years, maybe even 10 years if you're lucky. We don't have a nuclear breakout for Iran. But all that does is kick the problem down the road because when the sun sets, they can break out. It just delays the inevitable. And Israel knows that. And the world knows that. The other option, part B to this, is no Iran nuclear deal. And what that means is there is immediacy to Iran's plans. The word I've been using prophetically as well is accelerate. We're seeing the world's worst actors now as the U.S. is weakened in the eyes of the world with its current leadership. We are seeing the world's worst actors accelerate their plans, their sinister plans, their wicked plans. So what you'll see is basically what Iran would do after the sun sets on the Iran deal, say 5, 10 years from now. They'll just do it right away. Again, with the Iran deal, you're just delaying the inevitable. You're kicking the can down the road a few years. It's the problem's still going to be there, but that problem will come faster and sooner and with more force and suddenness, most likely, if there's no deal. If Iran right now just says, we're done, we're not negotiating with the great Satan, the United States, and we're plowing ahead with our agenda right now. Although we're patient, we want it now. We think the time is right now because we have a weak U.S. administration. If that's the case, you're going to see Israel act rather swiftly, in my view. I'm not going to put a timetable on it, but let's see what happens in the next few weeks. Certainly in Jerusalem, they're watching this and seeing how this all plays out. Is Iran going to come to the table? Israel might say, okay, they came to the table, they hammered out a deal with the U.S. Israel might say that buys us a little bit of time. Maybe Iran will behave itself for 2 years even. If there's no deal, it's just scrapped, and Iran just drives forward. Israel's going to say, uh-oh, there's a real sense of urgency. Hey, there's already a sense of urgency. Something has to be done. They're 2 months away from breaking out and having the bomb, potentially. So what the lack of a deal does to me, to my mind, is speed up the timeline for Israel to act. Or maybe it doesn't. Maybe Israel acts sooner. But I do know that the new Israeli government is eager to establish a rapport and at least a good working relationship with the Biden administration. But I can tell you, if Israel feels an existential threat is gathering, they're going to act no matter what, no matter who it offends. And they will act alone if necessary. Prime Minister Netanyahu was very clear about that, but it's been interesting to see the new Israeli government only in office here for 3 months. Obviously, there are a lot of different opinions about the new government, but one thing that has struck me is they have been very consistent in their messaging. It really echoes Netanyahu in terms of saying, hey, we'll act alone if we have to. Now, Benny Gantz, the Israeli defense minister, made some pretty surprising, to my mind, comments last week where he basically said, look, we can deal with a new Iran nuclear deal. We could accept it, but only if there's a plan B. And he said plan C is military action. I was a bit surprised that Gantz said that. Again, he's not the prime minister. Naftali Bennett would be the ultimate voice there, but Bennett didn't come out and say, hey, Gantz shouldn't have said that. So maybe Israel's thinking a deal buys a little time before they have to do what we all know is inevitable. They're probably going to have to strike Iran's nuclear facilities. Either way, I continue to say and believe, just based on conversations with Israeli officials at all levels, really, over the past few years and traveling to Israel frequently, that Israel will not allow Iran to acquire the bomb. I firmly believe that. I believe Israel will act preemptively if it must to prevent that existential threat from becoming a reality. There's a very solid track record of evidence there. Think back to 1981 when Israel struck Saddam Hussein's Osirak reactor in Iraq. Think back to 2007 when Israel struck Bashar al-Assad's reactor in Syria. Both times the world howled, but Israel did the right thing. And if you think the world howled in 81 and 07, you ain't seen nothing yet. Because when Israel strikes, if and when Israel strikes, probably when, strikes Iran's nuclear facilities, you will hear such outrage in the world that you haven't heard before, especially if they did it while the Iran nuclear deal was in effect. The world would blame Israel and say, you ruined everything. We had peace in our time. We're all screaming for peace. And Israel, you ruined it. Very clear where this is going prophetically, what the Bible says. The world is screaming for peace and safety, and it comes on them like the opposite, comes on them like a flood. And Israel will be, there's a good chance if there's a major, again, not if, but when there is a major Middle East regional war, Israel will be scapegoated by many folks because there will be repercussions globally, economically. It will touch us here as well. And people will point the finger at Israel for sure. This tiny nation, the size of the state of New Jersey, that's defending itself against a sea of enemies, hundreds of millions that surround it. The world is obsessed. The Democrat Party now is obsessed with this tiny nation known as Israel. And it sits at the very center of the world. If you look at it on a map, isn't that interesting? Hey, one thing I wanted to mention about Iron Dome, and we've got thousands of people with us now. This is great. We're getting to questions in 2 minutes. I'm going to take a sip of, in Philadelphia, where I grew up, we called it water. Now, you watching, my kind viewer, probably call this water. Water. That's what the rest of the United States calls it. In Philadelphia, where I'm from, we call it water. So humor me as I take a sip of water before we move on to our questions. I want to mention real quick, if you missed last Friday's newscast, that was September 17th. Very interesting story. Saudi Arabia. I mentioned the Abraham Accords earlier and these unlikely alliances that are forming, regardless of the Palestinian issue, between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Saudi Arabia now reportedly is interested in buying, guess what? Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system, which we've been talking about today on the newscast, obviously. Saudi Arabia wants a piece of it. Why? Well, two reasons. Number one, they are facing an absolute onslaught by Iran-backed Houthi rebels, which are launching rockets and missiles and attack drones on a daily basis into Saudi Arabia from Yemen at the behest of the Iranian regime. Secondly, the Biden administration just pulled its missile defense systems out of Saudi Arabia. Talk about timing. Just as the Saudis are, again, undergoing and facing this onslaught, they could really use some missile defense systems. The U.S. removes their missile defense systems, which were stationed around the Saudi capital of Riyadh. So the Saudis are looking to Israeli ingenuity, Israeli innovation, Israeli success in the form of Iron Dome and other Israeli missile defense systems, and they are considering purchasing them, and they should be considering purchasing them. But folks, talk about where we are on the prophetic time clock. You wouldn't have heard about this 3 years ago, let alone 5 years ago. Saudi Arabia purchasing weapons systems, missile defense systems from Israel? I'm telling you that 3 years ago, this wouldn't have been on the table, at least not publicly, maybe some back channel talks. And the Saudis would have never said, yeah, we did it. We purchased the Iron Dome missile defense system. We're in a new day now. The sheep and goats nations shaping up, Israel and the Sunni Arab nations on one side, the Saudis, Jordan, Egypt, the UAE, and on the other side, the Iranian axis, Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Shia militias in Iraq, the Assad regime in Syria. We have Erdogan of Turkey, who, by the way, gave a blistering anti-Israel speech at the UN General Assembly just yesterday, Wednesday, September 22nd. We have Erdogan, sometimes working with that Iranian axis, many times working for his own radical aims. The sheep and goat nations, it's lining up right now, and the prophetic chess pieces are moving. And a part of this could be, and as a proud American who loves this nation, it grieves me to my heart to say this, is part of this going to be the U.S. stepping back from its support of Israel, not the American people who are overwhelmingly pro-Israel, but the current government in the U.S. Is anyone watching? Does anyone watching, or would anyone watching be surprised if that Ezekiel Gog Magog invasion force gathered? We discussed this at length on our last live stream 2 weeks ago, September 9th. If you want to check it out here in our archives, do you really doubt that the Biden administration would stand back and maybe file a protest or a resolution at the UN, but do nothing, not lift a finger to help Israel? That's where we're at right now. Look up, because your redemption draws near. Hey, questions. We've got 15 minutes for questions. This is great. Many people commenting. This is great. God bless you all for joining us. We've got several thousand people with us. Okay. Daniel has questions. Pardon me as I look down at my phone and I read some of them. Let's see. Let's see. Looking through, guys. Give me 1 second. Lots of good questions today. Now, don't yell at me in the comments if I don't get to your question. Some people say, "You never answer my question." Well, I've got about 20 of them today, and I've got 15 minutes to answer. I love you all. I'll try. I'll try. Be understanding. Be gentle with me. Paul asks, "What can we do to stop the squad? Elections? Should we pray for informed leadership from them still?" Paul, I think it's unlikely you'll get informed leadership from them and wise leadership and godly pro Israel leadership based on what I've seen. Can they have a road to Damascus like transformation? Anyone can. And we can pray for that for sure, that God moves on their hearts and transforms them. Anyone is reachable. The Holy Spirit, the Lord your God, the Lord Jesus can reach anyone, even the squad. Do they have a heart that's willing to receive that? I don't know that, but we can certainly pray for that. In the meantime, I think elections would be the answer to get them out, their nefarious influence out of the U.S. government. The problem is they live in pretty heavily, each one of them lives in heavily left-wing Democrat districts where they seem to be popular. So that's not a good thing. Let me see the other part of your question, Paul, and that's a good one. Elections, and yeah, that's the thing. That's the main way you're going to do it. It would be nice, Paul, really, if the Democrat leadership came out against them and said, "Hey, enough. We won't stand for this. This is ridiculous." I'll give credit where it's due. The other day, there were some of the more moderate wing of Democrats, and there's still some left, but they're again losing losing influence and visibility rapidly as their party is consumed by the radical left. There were some that said, "This is ridiculous. We can't cut funding to Iron Dome. Israel's our greatest friend." So there was that. And again, this legislation passed overwhelmingly today. But where's the Pelosi's, the Schumers, the supposed voices of reason in the Democrat Party? And if that's your voices of reason, you've got a big problem. But where are they? They should be castigating the squad and saying this is unacceptable. But you're not seeing that. None of this bodes well. Let's see what else we have. More questions. More questions. Let's see. Daniel's sending them along. I'm reading them off my phone here, guys. Give me 1 minute. I want to get some good ones. Let's see. Why do you sound this is good. I think I've answered this before, but it's a quick one before we go on to the next question. Gail Jones, why do you say never hold your peace at the end of each show? Thanks, Gail. A lot of people ask that. I will just say Isaiah 62:6. Anyone watching right now, if you've ever wondered why does he say never hold your peace, go to the book of Isaiah, chapter 62, verse 6. I want you to read your Bible and open it up. That's why I'm not gonna say anything. Read Isaiah 62:6, and you will understand why I say it. Okay. Next question. Let's see. Question from Pookie Martinez. Pookie, I love that name. Pookie Martinez. You sound like one of my buddies from Philly. We all had nicknames. Pookie Martinez, sound like one of my buddies. Pookie asks, this is a good question. Will this weaponry that the Taliban seized, or was not even seized, it was basically handed to them by the United States, will it be used by the likes of China, Russia, Iran, etc., against Israel? Sadly, anything's possible in this regard because the Taliban, clearly China is exercising major influence in Afghanistan right now. Clearly, Russia is as well. And Iran also is kind of licking its chops and rubbing its hands with glee. Afghanistan is its neighbor, obviously. The two countries border each other. In the past, Iran and the Taliban butted heads. I expect a much smoother and more cordial relationship now between the two sides. 20 years, a lot has gone down. And in the assortment of radical players that is assembling right now, and as those chess pieces move on the board, the enemy of my enemy is my friend seems to be the order of the day. So it will not be shocking by any stretch to see the Taliban and Iran get along quite well and share intelligence. And perhaps Iran does get its hands on some of those weapons. China, Russia, certainly, I can tell you right now, they're on the ground and they are, let's say, observing or taking notes would be the better way to put it. This U.S. military hardware, advanced U.S. military hardware that was left behind. Could it be used against Israel one day? Certainly, the Iranian regime could use it. We talk about that Gog Magog war, the book of Ezekiel, chapters 38 and 39, that confederation that will one day come against Israel and lose very badly. Probably the worst defeat, one of the worst defeats in human history, when God intervenes directly and literally strikes down that invasion force on the mountains of Israel. Could they possibly be equipped, though, some of those armies with some of these weapons? Perhaps. That's not outside the realm of possibility. Isn't it hard to wrap your head around, folks, that the United States left billions of dollars of advanced weaponry behind, not to mention Bagram Air Force Base, in the hands of the Taliban? It is, if we get into it, my head might explode on screen. So let's move on to the next question. It's too frustrating and maddening, but we have to deal with it now. Okay, let's see what else we have. Daniel, what are you sending me? It's a good question. Samuel Loki asks, Eric, theoretically, could Iran buy a nuclear weapon from Russia or North Korea? Not too sure of the rules there, he says. They could, theoretically. I don't think Russia would sell them the bomb. I think that would be a bridge too far for Russia. Russia will look the other way and help them build nuclear reactors and kind of carry Iran's water at the UN. But will they actually sell them a bomb? Russia would be, if that got out, Russia would be an absolutely international pariah, uh, and really face, I think, sanctions consequences for that. If they became basically an arms peddler, and that was the big fear when the Soviet Union collapsed, actually, nuclear suitcases and all the rest coming out of Russia and getting into the wrong hands. But if Russia sent, it would be hard for Russia to hide that, secretly sell a nuclear weapon to Iran. If Russia did that and sold the bomb, sold an actual nuclear warhead to Iran, that would be, not that Vladimir Putin has shown a lot of regard for consequences or what the world thinks of him, but I think that might be a little too much for them. They would definitely feel the bite economically and be isolated if they did that. North Korea, on the other hand, is a total wild card. We know that Iranian scientists have been in North Korea without a doubt, and vice versa. Over the past several years, North Korean scientists in Iran, and Iran has been taking notes, literally. And I'm sure they've observed some of these nuclear tests that North Korea has conducted. So, in the very least, North Korea may not give them a warhead, or maybe they will. Again, total wild card, but um, certainly they will share the technology to their heart's delight with the Iranian regime. That's been clear. I think at the end of the day, Iran will develop its own bomb with a lot of help from outside actors like North Korea and the rest. That's what we see right now. Let's see what else we have. Any more questions? Let's see. We've got good. Let's see. Got some good comments coming in here. It's very active here. Okay. But let me look at another question here. Guys, keep sending them. Let's see. Let's see. Richard Mills asks, what do you think about the meeting that has been called for by Russia? They want a meeting between themselves, along with Syria, Israel, and the U.S. Honestly, Richard, I haven't heard about this yet. Russia wants a meeting. That's very interesting. Some breaking news by Richard Mills here on the Watchman Newscast. Russia wants a meeting with Syria, Israel, and the U.S. Extremely interesting, and it would make some sense based on, and I'm thanks for the hat tip, Richard. I'll check this out when we're done here. It would make sense in that we reported this on the newscast over the past 2 months. I think it's a very big deal, and not many people have talked about it. Russia is reportedly fed up and at their wits' end with Israel carrying out airstrikes against targets in Syria. And Russia has been making noise. A Russian general back in July making noise about supplying the Assad regime in Syria with advanced anti-aircraft missiles to shoot down Israeli incoming missiles and Israeli planes potentially. And the key point there that makes this potential meeting interesting is that Russia felt that it got a green light from the Biden administration during the meeting between Putin and Biden. I believe it was in June or July. Russian and U.S. officials, Biden, Putin, they all met face to face. And they felt like the US was saying, yeah, you know what? We're annoyed too by Israel carrying out all those airstrikes in Syria, probably because the target of those airstrikes is the Iranian regime and Hezbollah and its various proxies there in Syria. And that makes it harder for the US to sign a disastrous nuclear deal once again with the Iranian regime when Israel is doing that. So that they don't like it. So Russia took that as a green light. And now Russia's saying, if we get more involved in Syria and oppose Israeli activities in Syria more forcefully, the United States won't do anything. That's where that green light comes from. The US won't step in, they won't do anything. So, Israel, US, Syria, and Russia meeting would not be outside the realm of possibility. Perhaps they could meet on the side of the UN General Assembly, which last until Monday. I brought that question up not because I've heard about that yet, but I think it's interesting. If it's credible, I think it's just something interesting. It's an interesting discussion point because going forward, I think this is going to be a major, major deal. And one of our other questions was here, I forget the name, but as I'm scanning through the questions that Daniel's sending, it asked about the U.S. Or I'm sorry, Israel striking Damascus and attacking Syria. Jeremiah Whitaker is the name. Do you think Israel would bomb Damascus? Commenter Jeremiah Whitaker. Thanks for the question, Jeremiah. I think there is a chance Israel might bomb Damascus eventually because prophecy says Damascus will be destroyed. It will one day become a ruinous heap. It will cease to be a city. That's what the book of Isaiah, chapter 17, says about Damascus. I don't want to see that. No one wants to see that. I'm just telling you what the Bible says. The book of Isaiah, chapter 17, you can read that as well. While you're looking at Never Hold Your Peace, Isaiah 62:6, check out Isaiah 17. Damascus, and I'm quoting, will become a ruinous heap. It will cease to be a city. Remember, folks, Damascus is perhaps the world's oldest inhabited city. It's never been completely destroyed. Even the Mongols of Genghis Khan did not completely raze Damascus to the ground, but the Bible says that day is coming. So could that thing heat up? Look, they're officially, Syria and Israel, remember, are still officially in a state of war. That is the state of things right now. And Syria is giving safe harbor to Iran and Hezbollah. So needless to say, certainly anything could happen on Israel's volatile northern border as we know that day is coming where that great northern war between Israel, Iran, Hezbollah, Assad will likely throw his hat in the ring. We know that day is coming to Israel's north. Hey, as we close out here, and I got to about 5 or 6 questions, I think, and they were good questions. As we close out here, I do want to encourage you. I talked about Isaiah 17 and the destruction of Damascus. You might say, wow, geez. Continue reading to Isaiah 19. Isaiah 19 talks about a day that is coming when Jesus, Yeshua, returns to this broken world. A day is coming when a highway will stretch from Assyria, from the Iraq-Syria region, through Israel on to Egypt. And Israel, Egypt, Assyria will be united. And they will all be God's people. They will be together in a day to come. Read Isaiah 19. It is very, very encouraging. Folks, thanks so much for joining us here today on the Watchman Newscast live stream. We had fun as always. If you can call this stuff fun that we're talking about, but I enjoy talking about it to you, my special forces, the watchmen and women on the wall. And we're all watchmen and watchwomen. If you're here in the live stream, this is our core viewers. And I think most of us are coming at this from the same place. And we know the signs and the times. Absolutely. Like the sons of Issachar in the Bible who surrounded King David. We know what's coming and we're looking up and we're waiting in anticipation. We have the peace that surpasses all understanding because we know that through all this madness, God Almighty still sits on the throne. Thanks for joining me today on the newscast. Until tomorrow, God bless you. And remember, Isaiah 62:6, never hold your peace. Take care.